All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristina Brecko, Assistant Professor of Marketing here at Simon Business School. And today I'll be talking about marketing environmental change. The entirety of what I'm talking about today is based on a research paper with my co-author, Wes Hartman, titled Marketing and Economics of Harm Reduction, Evidence from Conservation Field Experiments. The big picture question that we're after in this paper is to think about the challenge of moving people's behavior towards some pro-social goal. The motivation and the empirical context is going to be residential water use in California, and in particular, outdoor water usage in California. So really kind of conservation, water conservation context. Now, for those of you that are kind of familiar with the water usage context in California, you'll know that actually the bulk of usage is in agricultural water use, but that context is very much regulated by a complex set of rules and regulations that actually doesn't make it amenable to studying questions such as these. So we're focusing on residential water use and in particular outdoor water usage. Now, the main motivation, as I already mentioned, is the California drought. So as it happens, 2012 to 2017 was one of the heaviest droughts in California. It also overlapped almost exactly with my time at Stanford doing my PhD. There's no causal relationship here, but it did happen to be the case. And during this time, I actually became very interested in how to use marketing to really drive conservation, or think about kind of what's the most effective way to move conservation in this context. So what happened? So 3 years into the drought, the governor called for mandatory residential water use reductions. A year prior to that, the governor had called for voluntary reductions in residential water use. Some people complied, but the average reduction was not nearly enough. And so the following year, mandatory residential water use reductions went into place. And the way that this worked is that essentially, the state tasked the local water utilities to achieve reductions in their service areas. So utilities were assigned these reduction tiers, ranging anywhere from about 8% reduction from the year prior in the lowest tier to 36% reduction in the highest tier. These tiers were really based on previous conservation efforts and previous usage. And so these utilities are then sort of tasked with lowering usage in their service areas. They can't use pricing because pricing for conservation is limited in California. So mostly the water utilities are using messages that call for conservation, as well as incentives and rebates for solutions that are oriented towards helping households conserve water. Now, the kind of messages and kind of incentives that were heavily used during this time, you can see on the slide here, right? So in the pictures here. So utilities were heavily promoting brown lawns, or entirely shutting off your outdoor watering. That's kind of one, and as well as incentives for removing your lawn. So these lawn removal rebates, essentially. Now, both letting your lawn go brown and removing your lawn is a really high impact solution. The letting your lawn go brown is a temporary solution, but even so, it's really high impact in the moment. And what we saw is that during these mandatory reduction periods, we do see a lot of reduction in usage. And so we see kind of those people that are either conservation minded or kind of on the fence respond to this kind of messaging and incentives. But even so, we see households, even during the drought, some households watering at a heavy rate, right? And so the idea here is that obviously this message or these incentives are reaching some households, but leaving some other households to high levels of usage, or kind of leaving them out of the conservation discussion at all. Okay, so what do we have in store for today? I'll tell you a little bit about how we thought about devising this marketing approach and how we thought about measuring the impact of this approach. I'll tell you about the field experiments that we ran out in collaboration with Redwood City Public Works, which is a water utility that's close by to Stanford, and Raccio, who's a manufacturer of a smart irrigation controller. And I'll talk about kind of the broader impacts or broader implications of our work and then open it up for Q&A. Okay, so what was the approach that we took? So really kind of the idea behind our paper is to take a harm reduction approach for pro-social change. Now, I want to be upfront, right? We don't claim at all that we invented the notion of harm reduction, but we are porting it over to the conservation area, and we're also defining kind of sufficient statistics to evaluate the success of harm reduction in this and other environmental and social contexts, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So what is the idea here, right? So when we think about promoting these highest impact solutions, such as brown lawns or lawn removal, right? So these solutions are really high impact if somebody takes it up, right? So if I were to remove my lawn, my water usage really goes down a lot. But the problem is that these solutions are most appealing to those who are either already conservation minded or place a relatively high weight on conservation relative to, let's say, the aesthetic benefits of having a green lawn or, growing your green tomatoes or kind of water intensive vegetables, right? These kinds of solutions are inherently less appealing to those who place a high value on these consumption benefits, water consumption benefits, right? And so what it means is that those people with the highest conservation potential are actually the least likely to adopt these highest impact solutions when they're being promoted, right? So, okay, so let's take that kind of as a first layer. Our proposal then is to say, in addition to marketing these highest impact solutions, can we also market a solution that is more aligned with the preferences of the heavy users that might have a lower impact? Right. So the idea here is that, maybe if taken up, the impact of the solution is not as high as removing your lawn or letting your lawn go brown, but it engages in conservation those households that would not otherwise engage in conservation. All right. So essentially these kinds of solutions, and in our case, we're going to think about the smart irrigation controller, which allows you to produce a green lawn more efficiently, but does not lower your water usage to zero, right? These kinds of solutions can help the heavy users reduce their impact, and this is kind of where the largest opportunity for conservation typically lies. But the problem is that on the flip side, this kind of solution may foster socially undesirable behavior, such as overwatering in others, right? And that second point is really where a lot of the pushback to the harm reduction approach comes, because there's an uncertainty about whether this kind of solution is going to draw from people who would have otherwise adopted the highest impact solutions or would have had a lower level of usage, right? And I want to be clear here that, the proposal isn't kind of promoting only this lower impact solution aligned with the heavy users' preferences. It's saying, in addition to promoting the highest impact solution, we might want to promote solutions that might appeal to those who are not engaging in conservation when only the highest impact solutions being promoted. And the idea here is really kind of central to, when we think about marketing, we think about heterogeneous needs and preferences. It's really saying that even when you're marketing for pro-social change, you should retain this focus on heterogeneous needs and preferences. So kind of adding this other point of marketing these lower impact solutions. And then the question is going to be, well, how do we know whether this kind of approach is going to be a success? And that's the second part of our contribution of the paper, is to think about what are the necessary metrics that we need to capture in order to figure out whether harm reduction works in this context. And so the kind of the main thing here is that, measuring utility from usage is really challenging, right? And so measuring welfare is really challenging because, we really need to kind of figure out how much value a given consumer assigns to each particular element in their utility function. So what we propose is that there are 4 sufficient metrics that the evaluation of such metrics is going to be better reflect welfare changes relative to just, looking at the aggregate consumption reduction benchmark, because the alternative is just looking, does water usage decrease, yes or no? But we lose out a lot if we don't consider these additional metrics. So what are those metrics? The first one is, do the most challenging respond to the promotion of the alternative solution? So in other words, do the heaviest users respond to the promotion of these harm reduction solutions? Or is it those who are already inclined to conservation and would have conserved otherwise, right? So is it aligned with the preferences of the heaviest users, but not the lowest users, right? So that's question 1. Who does it appeal to? question 2 is, how does the solution impact the consumption behavior? So does the solution decrease socially undesirable behaviors or foster them, right? So is it going to decrease water usage or actually increase water usage for some households? That's 2. 3 is, does the solution cannibalize highest impact alternatives? And this is an important one. In our context, highest impact alternatives are turf removal, right? So if the promotion of this device actually moves somebody to forgo turf removal but adopt, the device that's being promoted, then actually that's a net loss for conservation, because had we not promoted this device, they would have torn out their lawn and decreased their usage to 0, right? So we really need to understand, what a household would have done had they not received this promotion. And that's kind of one of the things that we want to measure in order to figure out the success. And finally, the 4th question is, does the solution decrease the consumption benefits? So, upon adoption of the solution, does the lawn still remain green? Do you get to enjoy your green lawn, or is there any reduction there? And so kind of looking at the net of all of these 4 metrics is really going to give us the answer of whether a harm reduction approach is successful in a given context. So let's talk a little bit about the field experiments that we run, and in particular, the solution that we're going to be promoting, or our harm reduction solution in our context. We're going to focus on the smart irrigation device. So this is a sprinkler controller that essentially allows you to input the parameters of your lawn and adjust watering, not just to those parameters, but also to real-time information about the weather, right? So when it rains, the smart irrigation device is going to shut off your sprinklers. When it anticipates rain, it's also going to shut off your sprinklers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of responding to real-time supply and demand conditions. Now, if we take a look at this plot here, it becomes sort of more clear on how this device works, right? So the green area here plots evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is the rate of evaporation from soil and other surfaces and transpiration from plants. And the x-axis are days. So you can really see that over time, there's a lot of variation in evapotranspiration, or evapotranspiration is high in the summer, it decreases in the winter, and in particular, there's kind of steep changes in these shoulder seasons. The evapotranspiration also dictates how much water your lawn needs in order to remain green, right? So you can kind of see that in the summer months, again, these needs are high, and then they decrease over time towards winter, et cetera. Now, if we think about the traditional sprinkler controller in California, right, the way that it works is that, when the rain stops, so precipitation here is in blue, a household might turn on their sprinkler to some average level, and typically it's something like, please water 15 minutes a day, twice a week, right? Some average level of watering, kind of a set it and forget it timer that doesn't really adjust to the weather conditions. And so if you set it at a high level, you can see that, in times when evapotranspiration is decreasing, you might be overwatering relative to what your lawn needs. And so if it is a household that has a previously high usage, adoption of a smart irrigation controller can be really beneficial, because the smart irrigation controller is going to trace out this green line, essentially the needs of the lawn, and as a result, generate savings relative to a traditional controller in seasons when there's a lot of change, right? So essentially, for high usage households, the device can really produce high efficiency gains, not just in the peak watering seasons, but also in the shoulder seasons. The problem is, if it's a household with previously low levels of usage that's adopting this device, then actually the results can be very different, right? So if you imagine this kind of red line being decreased to a level of 0.1, right, the previously low watering households, if they're adopting a smart irrigation controller, would increase their usage relative to their previous usage. And of course, if somebody, were to remove their turf rather than adopt, their usage would go to 0. If they adopt this smart irrigation controller, that would be much higher relative to turf removal, right? So we really need to contend with this kind of what would have happened had they not responded to our promotion. All right, so how do we evaluate the promotion of this harm reduction solution? So we run out 2 field experiments, as I already mentioned, with 2 partners. One is the Redwood City Public Works, and the other one is the manufacturer of a smart irrigation device that had early penetration in Redwood City. And what we essentially do, the first experiment is to really test out the level of discounts that's necessary in order to drive adoption. So there, We have 4 treatment arms and 1 control arm. The treatment arms essentially vary the discount levels from 10% to 80% off of the $250 device, and evaluate the adoption rates in these treatment arms. I also want to mention the importance of the control group here, right? So both of our field experiments are going to have a holdout or control group, which is essentially a group of households to whom we do not market the solution at all. And the idea here is that, if we were to just look at, a pre-post marketing campaign evaluation, we ran out both of these field experiments towards the end of the drought. And during this time, households on average were increasing their usage. So if we were just to look at a pre-post comparison, we would actually get very different results because everybody's increasing, right? So what we need is some sort of baseline, right? So what is the baseline rate of increase in water usage over time? And then compare that to the households to whom we actually market these devices, right? And then sort of ask the question of, for the treatment households, is the increase rate higher or lower than the control group to whom we did not market this promotion? And that control group becomes very important in the measurement of both the water usage and the other outcome measures that we're interested in. Okay, so that's field experiment 1. In field experiment 2, we just have 1 treatment arm. Essentially, we take all the learnings from field experiment 1, where we see sufficient adoption, but not statistical significance in detecting the changes in water usage. So we didn't have sufficient number of devices installed in order to be able to kind of gain statistical significance in our water measurement. And so in field experiment 2, we really we kind of take the learnings from field experiment 1, which is that we need deep discounts and also discounted professional installation, because that facilitates actual adoption and installation of the devices as well. And we only have 1 treatment arm that gets offered a free device, and 1 control group that does not get this promotion. In field experiment 2, we enroll all of the households in Redwood City, which is approximately 20,000, and we have sufficient installation of the devices in order to be able to measure the adoption heterogeneity and engage in the water impact analysis. Okay, so what are our results? So remember kind of the 4 metrics that I outlined. Essentially, this slide gives you the results for each of those 4 metrics, right? So what we see is that we see above average adoption relative to control for the high irrigation households, and those households that are eager to return to their normally high levels of usage as the drought eases up, right? So this means that these are kind of our 2 target groups, right? So those who are have high irrigation during the drought, and those who have low irrigation during the drought, but are eager to return to normal. We also see above average adoption for the conservation-oriented households, which is a potential problem, right? Because if those households that were previously conserving are installing this device, their usage might actually go up. And so the second point becomes very important. We need to measure the impact on water usage. So there we link data of a household's water usage to the household's adoption of this device. And we see that significant and long-lasting reductions in water usage are coming from high irrigation households only, and we see no changes for these other households. And just to give you a sense of kind of the magnitude of the results, we see that the installation of the device leads to reduction in water usage that is about the magnitude of 1 household's annual indoor water use. So it's pretty significant. So these heavy users, when they install this device, they have a pretty significant decrease in water usage. And also in terms of kind of monetary savings for the individual household, it recovers the cost of the device in about half a year for the household. And so it has both kind of individual and social benefits when we think about the water usage impact. We also measure whether we see substitution from turf removal as a result of our promotion. Remember, we don't want any cannibalization from the highest impact solution by promoting this device. And so in order to measure that, we collect data that is based on satellite imagery that essentially classifies the size of the lawn in any given parcel in Redwood City. And so what this allows us to do, and we have these measures, kind of a pre-post measures, pre-post experiment. So what this allows us to do is to measure whether those households that were in the treatment group forgo turf removal relative to those households that were in the control group because of the promotion of this device. We see no change for the treated households. And what this allows us to say is that we actually, these are not households that would have taken up turf removal had we not promoted. Rather, they would have continued their high irrigation without engaging in conservation in a meaningful way. And as a result of our promotion, they're able to reduce their water usage impact. And finally, we think about whether there's an impact on consumption benefits of those kind of highest users. We see no change in the greenness of the lawns, which again, from the satellite imagery, we're able to not just understand the square footage of the lawn, but also the greenness of the lawn, and we see no changes there. And so essentially we conclude that there's no effect on the consumption benefits or no substitution from turf removal. And really the main impact is coming from high users reducing their water usage and kind of more efficiently producing this green lawn. And so the takeaway here is that by taking these heavy users' preferences into account, we establish a solution that has long-lasting, and when long-lasting, I mean kind of 4 years onwards from our promotion, individual and social benefits, right? The long-lasting part is also important because it's been shown in the literature that many nudges need to be kind of effected over time in order for behavioral changes to be sustained. But in our case, the automation of the device sort of does all of that job. Once it's installed, it does it improves the efficiency on its own over time as well. Okay, so I'm a little bit over time, so let me just quickly mention the broader implications of our work. So the first one is really what I already mentioned and highlighted earlier, is this notion that even when we think about, marketing pro-social change, it's important to retain focus on heterogeneous preferences. Marketing is all about recognizing heterogeneous needs and preferences. But as we think about kind of marketing for pro-social good, oftentimes a lot of the advocates for that pro-social change have preferences that are aligned with that pro-social change. So for instance, a lot of conservationists are really interested in just focusing on the high impact solution because they believe that that's the right thing to do, right? But in reality, there's people have a variety of weights that they put on different kinds of elements, right? Not just conservation, but also the aesthetics. And recognizing that can draw into conservation people who would have previously been left out if we just focused on the highest impact solutions, right? So really kind of still maintaining that goal of conservation, but drawing in more people into conservation just by recognizing the fact that they might care about other things as well. And the second broad contribution here is that, really kind of the 4 metrics that we define that get closer to measuring the welfare impacts of a harm reduction approach in other environmental and societal issues contexts, right? And I outlined that earlier here, or earlier as well. I'm leaving that here on the slide. But the idea is that, we sort of define the metrics, the sufficient metrics that you could measure that could be more easily accessible than other measures of welfare, but go above and beyond just a measure of, what's the impact on consumption. So with that, I will wrap up and leave the floor open for Q&A. So let me just take a look at the questions that are popping up here. So Mike is asking, how does survey data sort of compare to real purchase data, if I'm sort of understanding this question correctly? Yeah, so kind of, surveys, essentially, yes. We see a lot of kind of, when people are asked, do you care about sustainability or do you care about conservation? In surveys, people are really inclined to say yes. But it doesn't necessarily bear out in kind of the real world terms. So I would encourage, so the approach that we take is essentially to run these field experiments, take it to field data, right? To actually look at real purchase data or real, when consumers actually have skin in the game, and evaluate how they behave then, right? And field experiments are one way to do this. Using observational data is another way to do this. But taking it to kind of the field data is really the answer that you should be looking for. Surveys can certainly get you a lot of the way, but it's not gonna give you kind of those real purchase occasions. Let's see. So the question here is, I've seen a lot of initiatives that are really trying to build social pressures to recognizing that, maybe wildflowers are the new normal relative to green lawns or kind of these really water intensive vegetation in your lawn. And can those social pressures, can they help essentially adoption rates? So yes, I think on both dimensions, right? So when we think about the highest impact solutions, this kind of messaging social pressures can certainly help drive adoption rates upwards. In our context, we actually used kind of the same idea to drive adoption of these smart irrigation controllers. So in the messaging, we also included kind of some messaging to build scarcity and also say, your block has been selected to get this free device. Tell your neighbors, as well as, we don't have enough devices to give to everybody, so take them up quickly. So really kind of to build the social pressure to make that treatment really strong. Our idea was to kind of, get as many people who would want to adopt in order to measure the water usage rates. But you can take it to the highest impact solution as well, right? So the social pressure can certainly add kind of a level of treatment to both of those dimensions. I received one question over email that I thought I would address, kind of, how to sort of convince collaborators essentially to engage in this kind of experimentation approach. I will say that, we partnered with Redwood City, and they're a very progressive water utility in California. They were willing to experiment, but it wasn't sort of by accident. We, talked to many different agencies to see what kind of initiatives they might be interested in experimenting with. But it's really all about kind of getting the right partners. And sometimes it means kind of reaching out to many and seeing who might be the good fit. Redwood City was interested in both testing out the effectiveness of these devices and then also, willing to experiment at all, right? Because just introducing this randomization is not a given, but it's actually really important to measure the effectiveness of your approach. And so I would sort of encourage anybody who's interested in measuring the effectiveness to always have a holdout group to have a baseline to compare to. So with that, I think we're just about out of time. So I will wrap it up. And thank you everybody for your questions. It was great to have a chance to present, and please reach out to me if you're interested in collaborating on questions related to this. I'd be excited to talk. Thank you very much, everybody.